Mr. Murphy, more than 8,500 COVID deaths were in long-term care settings, about 31% of fatalities. It's been 19 months since the pandemic started. You have pledged many times to do a thorough review of what happened in long-term care. Why haven't you done this review?
I want to echo, it's good to be here with Rowan, with you moderators. Thank you for having us, Assemblyman. Good to be on the stage with you. I think you just heard in the Assemblyman's answer, and I'll answer your question, Colleen. This race, and I suspect this debate, and we're now talking about COVID, but my guess is there are going to be many examples tonight, are going to be the difference between continuing to move forward and work toward that stronger, fairer state, or slip backward to the bad old days. And that's what this is about. This is quite clear. The tragedy today is there is a playbook. We know vaccines work. We know masking works. For folks to ignore that, disregard that playbook, is putting lives needlessly at risk. It feels like an answer you'd see in a debate in Texas or Florida. We will do exactly what I've suggested. There's no question about it. The challenge is we're still in the middle of the pandemic. It's better than it was, but it's not as good as it was on Memorial Day. We had the tragedy within the tragedy is in long-term care, and there will be a full accounting without question, independent of my office of this.
So we see the dictator Murphy really pushing for the mandates across the board. At one point, when it was inconvenient for him, he lowered the decisions down to the school boards so that people would have to fight it at all different places instead of one centralized place. And then he centralized it again and made it a very strict rule. The one-size-fits-all big government mandate situation, classic big government problem. So clearly that's not the way to go. We had the highest per capita death rate in the country until very recently. Now we just slipped to number 2 behind Mississippi for COVID deaths per capita. So that should tell people that something he's doing is not right. Something is not working. And quite frankly, we've never quarantined the healthy before. And that's part of the reason. The masks, as it is, they don't protect like people hope they do. For the most part, the viruses are smaller than the spacing in the masks. So people are being emboldened by going out with masks thinking that they're protected, and they're really not. And that's why we continue to have problems. Basically, we have to go through the process to get to the herd immunity at some point. On the other hand, with Mr. Chitterelli, he doesn't go far enough. He talks about, as far as the school masks for kids, wanting to have more exemptions available. All the science that we see, especially we have a team biostatistician who is well respected and published often. It's clear that the mask mandate does a lot more harm than good to children. So the only answer to that is to get rid of the mandate, replace it with choice. Quite frankly, different parents have different concerns for their children, different levels of concern of certain things versus other things. We've never quarantined the healthy. We have to be able to function in our society. So when you wear a mask, when you get a vax, it's defensive. It doesn't stop the offensive part of someone who's not vaccinated or masked. So, I mean, look, if you're showing symptoms, if you take a test, it's positive. I mean, we know that some of those are not accurate so well, but nonetheless, it should be something like that before you are quarantined as a sick person. But only the sick should be quarantined. So we have to get away from mandates with a few exceptions and go all the way over to the other side and just say, look, if people want them for themselves or for their children to wear masks, to get the vaccine, to quarantine at home, whatever it is, that's fine. On the other hand, other people, if they don't want to do any of those things, that's also fine. That has been the way it's been for all the diseases of the past. And look what happens with this one. I mean, even with a higher transmission rate than some, it's not the highest transmission rate we've ever seen. And we've done so poorly with the method employed. That just shows you the big big government um, the big government mandate is not the answer. We have to be able to have choice. Medical personal decisions have to be between yourself and your doctor, and if you're talking about a child, their parent, and that's it.
Mr. Murphy, as we recover from COVID, the state's unemployment rate is still above 7%, one of the highest in the country. At the same time, many businesses say they are struggling to hire enough workers. Why hasn't your administration been able to get more New Jerseyans back to work? You have 60 seconds, sir.
Yeah, so, Ben, we have. So that, thank God it's not as high as it was at the worst of this crisis. We had our lowest unemployment rate in our state's history before this pandemic hit. And it's hard to ignore that public health is the reason why we're still at a somewhat elevated level. But we've thrown a ton of money at small businesses. Only California and New York have put more money on the street. We'll continue to do that. We unveiled a program a couple of weeks ago called Return and Earn, which is cash on the barrel for the employee to come back, but also importantly, $10,000 in the first 6 months. By the way, small businesses only, for that small business to uptrain, upskill that employee. We think that's got a lot of potential. Last I checked, I think 2,500 small businesses had signed up for that. Our unemployment rate has come down. It will continue to come down, but we want to accelerate that as best we can, and we'll continue to do that. We still have some more American Rescue Plan money to put on the street, and I can guarantee you a good chunk of that will go to small businesses and getting folks back to work.
Mr. Murphy, I have a follow-up. You mentioned your Return and Earn initiative. Why has it taken so long to roll out that kind of program? This is a 30-second follow-up.
Well, we've put $780 million into small businesses since the pandemic began. Only California and New York have put more on the street, and we're the 11th largest state. So in all fairness, it may not have been in that program, but we've put a ton of money to work. The honest answer is we want to see what's working and what's not working. Cash on the barrel, for instance, does not appear to work. The upskilling piece, the workforce development piece with cash in the barrel for the employee, we think will work, and we're going to see it. If it does, we're going to expand that program dramatically.
A lot of the solutions we're seeing from big government these days is basically giving people fish, as the saying goes, giving them extra benefits, extra rewards for not being productive, where certainly there are cases where people cannot be. There's some kind of hardship, some kind of issue, but the vast majority can certainly work and be productive. And the more productive they are, the more they should be able to make. It's really a matter of what you contribute with your productivity and your skills as to what your monetary reward should be. When we have people that are getting so many benefits that it pays to stay home instead of work, you're really disincentivizing people, and that's the big government path to socialism/communism. It's all the same, and it always ends up the same. Just look at Venezuela. So we can't really go down that path and stay down that path. It should have never happened in the first place. We are where we are now. Now we have to fix it, which is to roll that back and find a way to ease people back into the workforce where they're not now left with a sudden removal of the benefits and not being prepared to be productive again. So we have to have in our tax structure, as small as we would like it to be, some amount of funding for job training or retraining. That to me seems to be the solution to eventually get people off of the government dependency and really be self-sufficient. It's the other side of the old phrase, we want to teach them how to fish, and then we want to leave them alone. And that's what big government on both sides of the aisle always try to fight. They always try to keep everyone dependent so they can control them and control the situation. And that's why I'm doing a review of this debate instead of being on stage with the other two. There's only one reason for that, and that's the money requirement that they set, knowing that we don't take special interest money like they do. We can't possibly get there. It would take a few years for anyone to meet that 1 year goal without that special funding. So we have a situation where we have to break the control of the duopoly parties by basically getting out voting to send a message clearly that we are going to make the change if they won't change things the way they ought to be. And the duopoly have no reason to change what they do to control everything, as long as everyone follows the herd and basically habit votes for one of the two, thinking that nothing else is really an option. It is an option. I am your option. I want to be able to serve you. So if we can get back to that kind of situation, and again, in the employment context, do the retraining kind of situation to get people self-sufficient. I mean, it scares the duopoly, because then we are much more free, but that is the right thing to do. That is what makes life better for everyone too. I mean, the people who start to become productive in a field where they have some skills, they're much more satisfied. I mean, the benefits of work have been documented in all studies far back as I am aware. So we have to promote that and really get people, again, to be independent and self-sufficient.
Mr. Chittarelli, you propose cutting more than $10 billion in spending and reducing at least a dozen taxes, including the millionaire's tax and other revenues. Which specific programs would you cut to balance the state budget? 60 seconds, please.
Michael, I think we need a tax system that works for everybody. Right now, that's not the case. The governor's budget is up $11 billion in 4 years' time. That's more than 30%. I don't see any type of cost cutting going on. A lot of people forget that at the height of the Great Recession, when we experienced the revenue cliff in Trenton, the budget went from $35 billion to $29 billion within 24 months, and we didn't raise taxes a penny. We didn't borrow a dime. The budget is up $11 billion. So just as it's that easy to increase spending, I think it's just as easy if we all sit down together to tighten the belt and find places to cut. I will tell you that I believe state government is bloated, inefficient, and corrupted by certain special interests, including those that have given the governor more than $10 million over the past 5 years. So I believe there's money to be saved. I believe it's a bloated, inefficient state government. We can save money there. A lot of people don't realize the single greatest expense line in our state budget, including the federal match, $15 billion for Medicaid.
May I respond?
One second, Governor. Which specific programs would you cut?
I'll tell you what I'll do, Michael. I will sit down on day one with the legislature. We'll have that conversation. But know this. His third budget was $42 billion. This budget's $46. If we go back to that budget, which he said was one of the greatest for New Jersey, we've already saved $4 billion. Let's look at that spending program 24 months ago.
Good. Governor,
Michael,
30 seconds, please.
3 quick facts. Hate to let the pesky facts get in the way. We have fewer employees in state government than the day I put my hand on the Bible. Number 2, why is the budget up? Think about it if you were a family and you didn't pay your mortgage or your rent. We inherited a complete and utter mess, and you were there for 6 years before I was. So we made a $6.905 billion pension payment, the first one in 25 years. We funded public education after you all had underfunded it by $9.2 billion. We're paying our bills. And by the way, every dime of the millionaire's tax has gone into the middle class for tax relief. Every dime.
Thank you, audience.
Every dime.
Thank you.
I got to tell
Mr.
you,
Chair,
Michael,
30
if
seconds,
he
please.
increased the budget $11 billion. If he had cut everybody's property taxes in half, I wouldn't have run for governor. I would have endorsed him. Listen, the budget's up $11 billion. People don't want to hand out. They want to hand up, and they want lower property taxes in this state.
Boy,
he
that's
hasn't
offensive. That's offensive. That is offensive.
Mr. Murphy?
That's another example of forward, backward. If you're out there,
Pardon me,
handout, I mean, come on, man.
Pardon me,
You're not
Mr.
paying
Murphy?
your bills.
Mr. Murphy, over the past year, New Jersey state revenues have been helped by $4 billion
Michael, I'm sorry.
in emergency borrowing.
I didn't hear the beginning. I apologize.
Over the past year, New Jersey state revenues have been helped by $4 billion in emergency borrowing and a portion of $6 billion in COVID relief funding from the federal government. These are one-shot revenues in that we can't rely on them again. Where will the money come from next year now that you've pledged not to raise taxes? 60 seconds, please.
Yeah, I'll give you at least 2 thoughts on that. First of all, in the budget that I signed for the current fiscal year, all $4.2 billion that we borrowed is spoken for. There's a big bucket for debt repayment, and there's a big bucket for debt avoidance, meaning I'll give you an example. The South Jersey wind port, we're going to lead the nation, if not the world, in offshore wind. That wind port would have forward versus backward. Again, you're hearing it live and in color. That would have been a $250 million bond. We don't have to do that now. That's one part of it. Secondly, on the federal money, our state has an awful track record, I might add, on both sides of the aisle, of spending one-off monies and filling up budget holes, making up for operating shortcomings. We're not going to do that. We're going to spend this wisely. We're not going to set programs up that leave the state holding the bag 2 or 3 years from now. And we've still got $3.8 billion of that American Rescue Plan
That's time,
money
Mr.
still to
Murphy.
spend.
Thank you. Colleen O'Day.
Mr. Chitterelli, you've called for an overhaul of the state's school funding formula as a way to lower property taxes, calling for, quote, fairer and flatter funding. How would you accomplish this? Do you intend to cut what is now court-mandated funding to many of the state's poorest districts? 60 seconds.
So I've said repeatedly that I'm not going to leave any child behind. I'm not going to leave any community behind. I'm certainly not going to adversely affect the quality of our K through 12 education here in New Jersey, even though I do think there's room for much improvement in our K through 12 education. I hope we'll get to that tonight. Under Governor Chitterelli, we're not going to send aid to the owner of $1 million home in places like Jersey City and Hoboken. That's what the current formula does. That's the reason why the owner of $1 million home in a place like Jersey City and Hoboken, towns that have experienced significant revitalization, are paying less in property taxes than a $400,000 home in places like Toms River, where the governor has cut aid significantly. Many of towns in Hunterdon County that have lost aid, Parsippany, my hometown of Hillsborough. That's not fair. That's something the Supreme Court doesn't know. It doesn't realize that by the way we send aid to places like Hoboken and Jersey City, $1 million homes pay less in property taxes than a $400,000 home. We're not going to do that. So that's why we need a flatter, more equitable distribution of state aid to schools. And in so doing, create equity across the board for
That's time, Mr.
property
Chitterelli.
taxes.
Thank you very much.
May I
30 seconds, Mr. Murphy. 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is another example of what I'm talking about. If you're in a black or brown community, or if you're a black or brown kid out there, you're going to get the rug pulled out from under you. This is the same flat funding formula that Chris Christie proposed in the spring of 2016, and he was driven out of the state. This is an us versus them move. There's enormous progress being made in black and brown communities where there's a lot of money being put to work. We have the number one public education system in America, but we don't have the equity we need. But the progress is undeniable.
Brianna?
We'll come.
criticize
Time is
me.
up. We'll come back to you, Mr. Chitterelli. Colleen?
Wait, do I
Mr.
not get a rebuttal because of the criticism?
30 seconds, Mr. Chitterelli.
I'm sorry?
30 seconds.
So it's interesting when he talks about the black and brown community. In his 4 years in office, he has not approved a single charter school for the city of Newark where 2/3 of the residents want charter schools. Not one. And if we want to get into the weeds of my formula, know this, it's not the flat funding formula that Chris Christie proposed, which would never pass muster with the Supreme Court. Mine will. He has not approved a single charter school in 4 years in Newark where they want them.
Forward versus backward.
Okay, we have to move. We have to move along.
Well, clearly there are several areas of the budget that can be taken apart and put to some better efficiency. Many cases with the free market and privatization, even shared services with other municipalities or between different municipalities. All those things are helpful, but we have really three big hitters in this arena of how do we cut the taxes. We start out with the school administrations. When we were younger, my generation was younger, and we were having small kids, everybody voted overwhelmingly yes for every school budget every year because it was the sacred cow of, oh, it's our children. We can't possibly deny the budget because then we're shortchanging our children. We'll be bad people and bad parents. Well, the problem is the money never made it to the classroom. And that's why, even though teachers have had some improvement with salary, certainly over the years, but they still have to get their own supplies and they still have to do a lot of things on their own. Also on the process side of teaching methods and things like that, the mandates have come from up top, a classic centralization that shouldn't be in place. So, on the other hand, all those budget increases over the years, they went to the administrations. And now we have multi-layers in all the numerous districts we have in the state that are really overkill in terms of layer upon layer of bureaucracy, all with, I would consider to be inflated salaries, bloated salaries, just totally not in line with the market, and because government doesn't have to be in line with the market if it doesn't want to. And it just smacks in the face of the idea of trying to improve education. We were, as a country, number one in the country many years ago, back to 70s and 60s, 50s, whatever. And then we established the Federal Board of Education under Carter. And then, of course, we also had the New Jersey State Board of Education come along. Now, while New Jersey as a state compared to other states still maintains a pretty good position in the rankings domestically, internationally, we're now 26th in the global comparison to other countries for education. That didn't happen by coincidence. We have overpayments like crazy to the administration side, and then we still have the classrooms struggling with one-size-fits-all agendas that really should not come from above. It should come at the local level. We should return control back to the teachers, where in different areas, different teachers have different training, perhaps different ideas of proven methods of teaching or favorable methods to really educate the students. Well, that's what we need in this country, and certainly in this state, is to have a variety of efforts going on where we can see what works better and what doesn't. And certainly we can have conferences to share ideas and things like that. We can get the information around on what's working, what doesn't seem to be working, and so on. But when you mandate that everybody does the same thing, there's no learning experience from the side of the teachers and even the administration. They're not seeing a comparison of different methods. They're all being made to fit into the same box, and it just doesn't work. So we have to get rid of that idea and really push the responsibilities down, decentralize, make that local. So that's one area for the budget part. As far as the second area, the pensions, a lot of them are overfunded or having some kind of disproportionate funding from the state. Not all of them, but there are a number of pension programs that need to be trimmed down. And it's really, I mean, to some extent, you've made commitments already to funding that has occurred, but those allocations need to be changed for going forward. And also the employment contracts have to adjust accordingly to say that, this is not going to be an overbloated pension. It's going to be in line with private industry. Actually, the better solution is to privatize some kind of equivalent to 401k or IRA with private money management, where the money isn't put into the government's hands first, because we also know that some pensions are pilfered by the government as a borrowing mechanism, so to speak, for using it for other pet projects and then increasing our debt that we have to pay back. It just, again, is a wrought for disaster, and especially with the moral hazard that the government by definition owns, which is the idea that because they have an unlimited supply of money, if they really need it, they cannot be held accountable. So they just will manage, or I should say mismanage, as much as they feel like, and they have no fear because there's no accountability. That's why one of our things, we have the freedom slogan, which was already covered in the first part, and now this is the accountability slogan. So these are key points to making things work better. The third area for cutting the budget is basically centered around the Medicaid system. It has been taking in a lot of money, and quality of services has continually dropped. So we need to also find a way to make the Medicaid system more competitive. We have to have bidding process for pricing and all this kind of stuff to be able to make sure that Medicaid becomes efficient also. I mean, we do need to help certainly our seniors as far as having a program, and we just need to make it work better and provide better health care at better costs for all our seniors.
Mr. Chitterelli, you've called for an overhaul of the state's school funding formula as a way to lower property taxes, calling for, quote, fairer and flatter funding. How would you accomplish this? Do you intend to cut what is now court-mandated funding to many of the state's poorest districts? 60 seconds.
So I've said repeatedly that I'm not going to leave any child behind. I'm not going to leave any community behind. I'm certainly not going to adversely affect the quality of our K through 12 education here in New Jersey, even though I do think there's room for much improvement in our K through 12 education. I hope we'll get to that tonight. Under Governor Chitterelli, we're not going to send aid to the owner of a $1 million home in places like Jersey City and Hoboken. That's what the current formula does. That's the reason why the owner of a $1 million home in a place like Jersey City and Hoboken, towns that have experienced significant revitalization, are paying less in property taxes than a $400,000 home in places like Toms River, where the governor has cut aid significantly. Many of towns in Hunterdon County that have lost aid, Parsippany, my hometown of Hillsborough. That's not fair. That's something the Supreme Court doesn't know. It doesn't realize that by the way we send aid to places like Hoboken and Jersey City, $1 million homes pay less in property taxes than a $400,000 home. We're not going to do that. So that's why we need a flatter, more equitable distribution of state aid to schools. And in so doing, create equity across the board for property taxes.
That's time, Mr. Chitterelli. Thank you very much.
May I?
30 seconds, Mr. Murphy. 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is another example of what I'm talking about. If you're in a black or brown community, or if you're a black or brown kid out there, you're going to get the rug pulled out from under you. This is the same flat funding formula that Chris Christie proposed in the spring of 2016, and he was driven out of the state. This is an us versus them move. There's enormous progress being made in black and brown communities where there's a lot of money being put to work. We have the number one public education system in America, but we don't have the equity we need. But the progress is undeniable.
Once again, Chitterelli doesn't go far enough. He's talking about tinkering with the school funding formula, where the only real answer is school choice, where the funding follows the student. Basically, all the students should get the same government funding, and it should be applied to whatever school choice the parents make, whether it's in the public system or not. And the fact is, this is another case of free competition that will create efficiencies and force better work and better work product in terms of the education that the various school systems provide, including the public system. If people have to be efficient but still effective, then they will do that in order to get more funding by attracting more students. Now, if the students are moved out to another option, it's because they're getting a better education somewhere else, and that's where the money deserves to go then. If somebody's doing the education thing right, they should get more funding. So the natural course of the market will create a situation where people will move their children to the school that's best for their education needs. So if all the students throughout the state have those kinds of options, it can only improve the situation. And again, certainly internationally, we have a long way to go to be able to get back to the top. And that's where we want to be with our children. We want them to be the best educated workforce when they grow up, and we want them to be productive and effective in order to do all the things about innovation and creativity and productivity to make this the gold standard of living in this country and in this state versus other places. We want to be the best. We were a long time ago, and we need to get back to that.
Mr. Murphy, you campaigned calling marijuana legalization a matter of social justice. Why haven't you commuted sentences and pardoned people who are still locked up for low-level, nonviolent marijuana offenses, which you have the power to do? 60
I got to say
seconds.
two things at a point of personal privilege, other than God bless your son, Assemblyman. This would have been my late brother Wal's 77th birthday, so God bless you, pal. And I meant to acknowledge my wife, and three of our four kids are here, and the fourth one, Charlie's watching at home. I think, David, we've expunged 362,000 low-level drug offenses last I checked in terms of numbers. So we did it for social justice. I'm thrilled that adult use, adult, important word there, is going to create jobs. It's going to create a new industry. It's going to create revenue for the state. I'm thrilled with all that. But the reason I got there, particularly as a father of four, is social justice. We inherited the widest white, non-white gap in terms of persons incarcerated of any state in America, and the biggest reason was low-end drug crimes. So I could not support legalization without having a symmetrical look back, and we've done that, and we'll continue to do that.
We're talking about pardoning, which you could have done as soon as you became governor.
Yeah, but I mean, 362,000 expungements, David. That's not like one or two. That's a huge first step. Whether or not we ultimately get to pardoning, I leave open as an option, but that's a lot of lives that are put back on their feet, and I'm proud of that.
So here's an example of Governor Murphy not doing what the will of the people is in terms of the marijuana legislation. We had a vote last year. It was overwhelming, as he has said, and so proudly, roughly 2-to-1 ratio, that people want marijuana legalized, decriminalized, what have you. And yet, one of the first things you would expect is, okay, everyone in jail now as a non-violent drug offender would be released and really put to whatever kind of either a mental health professional or social worker or whatever kind of medical addiction, addiction program that was appropriate for them. Instead, those folks are still sitting in jail. And in fact, it was around the end of January this year where I had heard that between the election in November last year to that point in January, there were another 6,000 arrests for nonviolent drug offenders and for use only. So that tells me that, well, he tries to talk a good game about caring about the minority communities that are inordinately impacted by the drug laws. And he mentioned in the prisons, we have disproportionate minority prisoners because primarily these drug laws. Well, so why didn't he do anything to get them released? Why doesn't he pardon all those people who are nonviolent drug offenders and get them the help they need, or whatever? I mean, whether it's the addictive help or like getting back into the workforce, getting back to normal life. This was the priority. I mean, it's one thing to get to the point of talking about legalizing and decriminalizing, and that's all good. But we have to get people back out of prison and back on their feet. And otherwise, I mean, we have to just make sure that we have good information for folks in terms of what they would like to use or not use, just like with alcohol, with prohibition. I mean, we know that the rules don't work, just like the drug war didn't work. So we want to make sure that we have a situation where people can get the information they need to make good choices. Also, of course, it's parents' job to teach their children to make good choices early on, but with the idea that if they want to do something as an adult that really, I mean, maybe it can be harmful to health in some way if it's overdone, but that's the freedom that adults have. They can choose to do these things. And as we've seen with the past examples, it never works to restrict that. It just makes the situation worse.
Mr. Chittarella, you say you proudly defend the police. Should residents have a role in reviewing the conduct of law enforcement who are sworn to protect them? And would you support allowing civilian complaint review boards in New Jersey to have subpoena power? 60 seconds, please.
This governor and his attorney general have been the most anti-police we've ever had. They've handcuffed our police, they've disarmed our police, they've demoralized our police. The job has never been harder. Do we need reforms? You bet we do. We need to recruit more women into the profession and more black and brown people into the profession. And we need more community policing programs to build trust and a great relationship between the community and our police. I'm very, very fearful of the number of programs that are being talked about by the governor and other Democrats around the state, such as getting rid of qualified immunity, civilian review boards with subpoena power, putting disciplinary cases on the internet. I believe there's other ways for us to address the issues we have. I want to get rid of bad
Mr.
cops.
Citarelli. Thank you very
Good
much.
cop. I'm sorry?
That's time. Thank you.
May I respond?
Yes, you go ahead, sir.
Two things. Number one, there's one candidate on this stage that has multiple endorsements from police unions, and it's me, number one. Number two, we're guided by accountability and transparency. That's body-worn cameras. It's training. It's deepening in the relationship between police and the communities they serve. It's readdressing the use of force, which we have done in this administration. And I'm the first governor since Governor Kane to have funded not one but two state police training classes inside of 1 year, and I'm proud of that.
But, Governor, would you sign into law a subpoena power for CCRB?
I don't think there's one size fits all. I apologize. I meant to say that to you. I think it works in certain places, and it doesn't necessarily work in all places. It's now currently existing in 2 communities. I would take it on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. We need to move on.
So on police reforms, we have Governor Murphy talking about the transparency that he suggests has been accomplished, the improved training that he suggests has been accomplished. However, we still have problem issues that arise. Now, in terms of accountability for the police, there are many cops who are there to serve the public and do a good job. We always have bad people in any group, and certainly there are some bad cops as well. So the main item on our list of platform in terms of that is getting rid of the qualified immunity. It seems like it's too protective, where on the one hand, police make split-second decisions, and it's harder to question those when we're not in them, I think, to some degree. However, there are clear violations that occur, and excessive use of force depending on the situation. And we really have to help train the police in terms of better interaction with suspects or what have you. Also, and I've spoken to several police officers at many of the tour events that I've been on with my 221 county tours, plus all the other stops I've made this year. On the one hand, we're talking about having police typically be the first on the scene for any kind of crisis situation, but they're not always the right professional for what's going on. So they need the training in, when should we recognize that we need a mental health professional on site as soon as possible? When do we need a social worker on site as soon as possible? Any other, professionals that would be appropriate for a situation. We need the police to be the one who can detect something when they're the first one there and know exactly who it should go to for handling. And it's not always them. When we have so many victimless crimes on the books, we get into trouble, because that's where, if the police approach someone with a situation like that, the people naturally react more defensive to say, why are you bothering me? This is nothing. This is not important. Why are you making something out of this where it really shouldn't be? And with a victimless crime, that's not, that's not a lie. So the idea that we take away these crimes means that, then the police can focus on the more significant crimes against persons or property, murder, rape, assault, all these kinds of things. I think most people want the police to step into those situations and handle it. Those are the dangerous situations really that they were hired for, and that's what most people feel is where they belong. So we have to make that dividing line. What should the police be doing and not be doing? And my feeling is that if we do that, we'll have far less incidents like George Floyd, or even going back a little bit for me is Rodney King, or any of these other stuff. If there's certain things that are happening, then the police have to know that they're not having the pressure to deal with every single situation, no matter what it is. It should be more logical. And that's reform of the criminal justice system. It's reform of the laws. And it's also extended training. Other than that, if the police are recruited within the town that they're going to police and people know them, that certainly can be a built-in advantage to improving relations between the police and the community. But whether or not it's sort of homegrown officer recruits, the idea is that we really need regular outreach where people understand what the police are trying to do, or in the case of my proposals, what they will not be doing anymore, and how they're trained, what the situation is like, why the training is the way it is. Once we modernize or refine it, then maybe people will have more confidence in them as well, and we won't have as many incidents arising. It seems to me that's the way. Is the best thing usually to avoid problems is when everybody understands each other better.
Mr. Murphy, you have continued to divert money from New Jersey Transit's capital budget and the Clean Energy Fund to pay for the agency's operating costs. Why haven't you found a dedicated source of funding for NJ Transit? 60
I'm
seconds.
open-minded to that, but if you talk about the mess that we inherited, the mess within the mess was NJ Transit. No engineers, political cronies, underfunding, unsafe, a disaster. We are fixing NJ Transit. On-time performance is up. Cancellations are down, customer satisfaction is up, and we've done it without raising one dime of the commuter paying in their fare over the past 4 years. I'm open-minded to a permanent source, but we're not waiting for that. We've got new capital stock that's come in. We're redoing our stations. We've got new green buses and locomotives. As I said, customers see the progress. We've hired a record number of engineers. It was pathetic what we inherited. And this used to be, by the way, the #1 transit system in America. Perennially, it was held up as the gold standard. And it had been ruined by the administration that preceded us. And we've turned this thing around.
Mr. Chitterelli, where will you find the money to fund? Mr. Chitterelli, where will you find the money to fund NJ Transit without raiding its capital budget and other funding sources, as you pledged to do if elected governor? 60 seconds.
We've been raiding the capital fund to pay for operating expenses.
Where will you find the money then?
Here now, we've got $10 billion right now to take care of our greatest priorities in terms of capital investment. That means SDA, School Development Authority schools, and New Jersey Transit would be my top 2 priorities for that $10 billion. If we make the necessary capital improvements, you'll see vast improvement in the operation of New Jersey Transit.
So here we have Governor Murphy showing how irresponsible he is in a fiscal sense. The taxing by the Democrats, as well as traditionally in recent years, the borrowing on the Republican side, puts us where we are today. A totally overblown budget, huge government, nothing but problems. And as we like to say, the leading cause of death over the course of human history is big government. We are your only small government option. So part of the reason to eliminate big government is exactly this point on New Jersey Transit. Governor Murphy uses the capital budget fund to fund operational expenses, day-to-day operations. That is a classic violation of basic separation of different funds. You should only have an operating budget for operational expenses. And he talks about how he hasn't raised the fares on New Jersey Transit. Well, that's because he's stealing from the capital budget fund. If he couldn't do that, and he's really not supposed to, but if someone would enforce against him not to do that, he would have to create a permanent source for operational funding for New Jersey Transit, and now your rates would triple. Okay, so that is the inherent problem with his answers. He does something wrong on one side fiscally, and it allows him the luxury of making something else more public facing look good, and then he touts that as an accomplishment. There's no accomplishment here. This is a classic shell game. We have a crony capitalist on this side who is doing whatever he has to do to manage the money in a way that helps his corporate friends and leaves everyone else paying the bill. So it's just like when they got rid of the estate tax, they replaced it with the gas tax, which instead of affecting the wealthier people, now we're affecting the poor people. And clearly the wealth gap has risen exponentially under Murphy, and this is part of the reason. He keeps doing these shell games and not showing the whole picture. He's not being transparent by any stretch of the imagination. And so we wind up with a situation where now the poor are struggling more than ever. And he has not been a champion of any disadvantaged people, I can tell you that. So we have to get away from this sort of running roughshod with the budget. If it wasn't for the borrowings and then the bailout, we would be in so much trouble. He never would have balanced that budget. And now he got all this money and he's going to divert it and still create a situation where our children, our grandchildren, probably our great-grandchildren are still paying off the debt down the road. It's irresponsible. It's also not following what the rules say in terms of disclosing to the public what you're using money for when you collect it. You're supposed to use it for particular types of purposes, and here, as often he does, he crosses over the lines between things to make himself look better on one side that the public sees. It's all, like I said, a shell game. And for that matter, Jack has no answers for that either. I mean, we have our big, heavy-hitting areas where we want to reduce the budget and basically reduce the taxing, reduce the borrowing, and it's not anything on anyone else's radar. So hopefully with all of that, we'll be able to do okay. And I think we have a plan with all that and some more that will in fact reduce taxes and reduce spending. I mean, the taxes can go down maybe temporarily once in a while to make people look good, especially in an election year. But the true test is, are you cutting the spending? Well, we have that plan and we can make it work.